Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Let's share my presentation and hope that there are no tech issues. Right. Can I have a thumbs up if we can see the presentation? Fantastic. Right, thank you so much for inviting me along to today's session. I'm Beth Colliety. I'm a policy officer at the Royal British Legion. And as the author of the Royal British Legion's new report, Unpaid Carers in the Armed Forces Community, I'm going to run through some of its key findings and recommendations. The aim of this research was to increase what we know about unpaid carers in the armed forces community and their needs, enabling us to set out how support can be improved. The Royal British Legion's household survey of the ex-service community back in 2014 found that the community was disproportionately affected by caring responsibilities. So you're almost twice as likely to have a caring responsibility as in the general population. But beyond that, we didn't know a lot about the needs of this group, their experiences, and we hope this research helps to kind of start a useful dialogue about the distinct needs of these carers, as they are indeed distinct. Overall, as I'm going to talk to you about, unpaid carers in the armed forces community feel unappreciated, unsupported, and they face some really unique issues. So our report shares those experiences and looks at how they could be better supported by making recommendations. This includes improving awareness of their needs and enabling these carers to access the tailored provision that they urgently need. Before I go into our research and its findings in a bit more detail, I'd like us to hear a bit from one of RBL's beneficiaries, Dorothy, who was kind enough to share some of her experiences as an unpaid carer for her husband, Angus, who served in the army for around 10 years. Dorothy's family is steeped in military history going back about 5 generations. Dorothy's been supported by RBL's Admiral Nurses Service, who support the armed forces community and their families living with dementia. Let's hope I can play the video with sound. If there's any sound issues, please let me know in the chat. Oh, all right, let's just. So apologies, some of you weren't apparently able to see the video, but hopefully that can be circulated. But we've heard from Dorothy about some of the impacts her caring responsibilities have on her. And it's really important to put voices like Dorothy's at the centre of this discussion. To do this, we used multiple research methods as shown on the slide. So we did a desk-based review of a wide range of sources from the UK and beyond on unpaid carers in the armed forces community. Due to the pandemic, there were limitations on field research throughout 2020 and 2021, so we focused our data gathering on an online survey. And we're really grateful that 358 carers from the UK's armed forces community shared their experiences with us. And when we break down the carers who took part in our research, they represented different elements of the armed forces community. So the largest group were veterans who were also carers, followed by carers who support a veteran, carers in a serving family, and carers who currently serve in the armed forces. A number of the report's recommendations applied to the whole of the UK, but due to almost 90% of responses coming from carers living in England, several are specific to health and care in England. A note on context and why we think improving support for these carers really is urgent. In line with the Armed Forces Covenant, we've recommended that the needs of the Armed Forces community are considered within more detailed proposals for social care reform committed to by the government. We don't want to see any more responsibility shifted onto unpaid carers, and we think that unpaid carers should have an important voice in this reform. To support this year's census in England and Wales provides a really crucial opportunity to improve our data on the number of these carers, as for the first time it asked both about veteran status and caring. Another important element of context is that COVID-19 appears to have exacerbated difficulties that already existed for these carers, making it harder for carers in the armed forces community to access support and social connections. So when we asked these carers about the impact of the pandemic on them, over half had seen a reduction in the services that they and the person they care for need. 63% also said that the time they spend caring has increased. Carer health and wellbeing. So half of survey respondents told us they spend 50 or more hours a week providing care. There also appear to be long-term commitments, with 1 in 5 having provided care for 15 years or more. And we can see that caring responsibilities have had a significant negative impact on carers' own health and well-being. More than 70% of the carers in the armed forces community who took part in our research said caring has had a negative impact on their mental health in the last year, and half say it's negatively impacted their physical health. This perceived mental health impact was highest among carers in a serving military family at nearly 90%. We can see that carers are also not able to take breaks from their caring responsibilities. So fewer than 1 in 10 carers in the armed forces community have had a break from caring in the last year. And this was even lower for those caring for a veteran, where less than 1 in 20 had had any break. And unfortunately, as Dorothy mentioned, these carers can also feel lonely. Members of the armed forces community are exposed to events and challenges that can make them more vulnerable to loneliness and isolation. And the carers who took part in our research were more likely to report experiencing some degree of loneliness than the armed forces community as a whole is. We've previously recommended that local authorities can improve the measures they take to support groups who are at a high risk of experiencing loneliness, including the armed forces community. We think this can be done by recognising the specific hazards of loneliness and social isolation among the armed forces community, thinking about how this group can be supported in local health and wellbeing assessments and strategies. When we look at the impact of caring for complex health needs, we found that the people being cared for were most likely to have a physical health condition. So about 80% of those being cared for had a physical condition, while 43% had a mental health condition. And while the majority of people in the armed forces community don't experience mental health problems, those that do can experience them in an acute way. Some carers of veterans who have complex mental health conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, experienced a negative impact on their own health and well-being and really wanted the impact on them to be considered, with specialist professional support provided to the carer. The evidence suggests that the needs of carers should be supported in their own rights, rather than viewing the carer simply in relation to the veteran's mental health problem. When we look at those who in the serving community who are caring, so that is people who are currently serving or someone who's got a serving person in their family. But half of the serving carers who took part in our research said that military deployment has had an impact on their ability to carry out their caring responsibilities. So serving carers and carers in a serving family told us that deployment and postings can have a detrimental impact on the continuity of care and their ability to care. Significantly, only 11% of people who identified as serving carers feel that they can balance their caring responsibilities with their military career all of the time. And some carers who took part in our research had ultimately made the decision to leave the armed forces due to the impact service life had on their caring and what they felt was a lack of support in place for them. Although some colleagues were supportive on an individual basis, serving carers wanted to see a consistent recognition of their caring role. They wanted better recognition, understanding and flexibility from the chain of command, enabling them to better balance their military career with their caring responsibilities. Some steps have been taken by Defence Primary Healthcare in service to improve the identification of serving carers, but this can be built on more effectively. Our analysis in this report shows that carers and their support needs are not adequately recognised in tri-service or single service policy. And there also appear to be barriers for some carers in accessing policies like flexible service and choice in appropriate service family accommodation. So we're seeing some clear barriers there. A headline when we look at access to support is that carers in the armed forces community who took part in our research are receiving half as much support as carers in the general population are. So 2 in 5 have had no support in the last 2 years, which is double the proportion of carers in the general population who don't have support with caring. Those caring for a veteran were even less likely to have received any support. Carers were most likely to have received informal support from family and friends, as opposed to from statutory or voluntary services. For example, only 1 in 5 had received any support from their local council. In fact, carers in the armed forces community are less likely than carers in the general population to have had a carers assessment or a review of their carers assessment. Only 17% of respondents to our survey had had a carers assessment or review of it in the past 2 years, and this is compared to 27% of carers in the general population having had an assessment or a review. So we can see they're less likely to have a carers assessment. In March 2021, NHS England and Improvement published its forward view outlining its current and future commitments to improve the health and well-being of the armed forces community. They also highlighted considerations for integrated care systems. And a key one of these was for integrated care systems to consider how carers from the armed forces community can be supported in local carer strategies. So in line with this, one of the recommendations we make in the report is for local authorities to consider how carers in the armed forces community can be supported in their local carer strategies and how they can be encouraged to take up a carers assessment, which they're less likely to have had. Only a quarter of carers in the armed forces community who responded to our survey feel that health and welfare services they come into contact with recognise and value the support they provide as carers. Few carers only 11% of those we heard from have been asked about whether they or someone they care for has served in the armed forces, which would enable greater identification and signposting. We think the needs of these carers can be included in existing NHS schemes which aim to increase awareness of the health needs of the armed forces community. And we also saw that carers wanted access to peer support from other carers. We think this is an important area where armed forces charities can help to facilitate this peer support. So overall, the findings I've discussed today, the whistle-stop tour, show that carers in the armed forces community are experiencing a negative health impact and an unequal access to support. In total, the report makes 22 recommendations, and I'd like to just cover a couple of key ones. So firstly, we call for more tailored provision for these carers, including the Office for Veterans Affairs, Ministry of Defence and Department of Health and Social Care, working together to improve access to free respite care for the armed forces community, enabling their unpaid carers to take breaks. And we also think the NHS should invest in mental health and relationship support dedicated to carers of veterans with PTSD, as well as improving awareness of and access to the support offered to families by Op Courage in England. Another key area is improving awareness of unpaid carers and their entitlements among professionals at every stage of military and post-service life. This includes our call on the Ministry of Defence to explicitly recognise the needs of carers through a carers policy, to better support these carers and address the barriers they face. We'd like to see forums that represent and include unpaid carers involved in developing this policy, so we listen to lived experience. And I've already mentioned the key recommendation locally around local carer strategies and take-up of carers assessments. And overall, to address the lack of support these carers have clearly been receiving, central government, local authorities, the NHS and military charities really can all play a role. So thank you for listening to the findings of our research. I'm very happy to take any questions in the Q&A session later today, but if you'd like to follow up with me directly or get in touch, my contact details are on the screen. Thank you.